Hey, Tom Bartels from growfoodwell.com. And I just wanted to get this follow-up video out to people that are spring gardening and those that are looking for seeds and seedlings. And a lot of the questions that are coming in right now are part of the wave of people that are out buying seeds or just have bought seeds or seedlings. And they're concerned about getting plants out and really gardening this year in a big way. There's a surge on all the seed companies online. I've got lots of questions this week about people trying to find seeds even at the main seed companies. And it's in response to this concern for getting a little bit of self-awareness of how much you could control your own food and get your own garden going this spring. So I understand the effort there, but I just wanted to at least go over some of the basics to help some people out, because statistically, many or most of the people that are out buying seeds right now are going to fail. And they're going to fail mostly not because of the seeds, although that is part of the equation, and we'll talk about that in a second, but because of technique or lack of technique or methods, whether they don't understand the soil biology so much, or the timing, or the different methods of planting to align with natural cycles that help you grow each year. And consequently, a lot of these people are going to give up after the first season because they spent too much time weeding, and they're going to have these big weed patches with very frail vegetables perhaps, or they're going to work all summer long weeding and doing so much work that they just think that gardening is not worth the effort. So in either case, it's really not that hard once you understand how to align with natural cycles and natural systems that help you garden in a big way. And that's what my course is about, and that's what we're going to talk about briefly today with just some overall tips about early spring planting. So this is kind of a follow-up to the video I shot last week where I was putting together all the soil blocks. Here we are a week later. I've got about 450 seedlings under the lights here. And I've got about 100% germination rate because these are really good seeds. Let's talk about that briefly. If you just bought seeds or are in the market to buy seeds, you want to look definitely for open pollinated seeds. And that's because you can save the seeds each year. Like I have here, these are all seeds from previous years growing. And if you have open pollinated seeds, you can save those seeds maybe in a portion of your crop each year, let it go to seed, save that for the next year, plant them out, and away you go. And then you're less dependent on seed companies in the first place. But then you have a perpetual supply of seeds, which is really the way to go. And each year your seeds become more acclimatized to your particular situation where you live. So in this case, I've got my long season growers, some lettuce to get some early lettuce out. We're still freezing here for another 5 weeks, so I can't plant much out right now. I don't have a greenhouse, but you can see that I've just got this makeshift light situation that I put in my office every year. It shows that you don't need a lot of infrastructure, and I'll talk about that in a second. But these 450 seedlings will be under lights for about the next 5 weeks, at which point I'll have my last frost date or thereabouts and be able to plant them out in the garden after I harden them off for about a week. And what's going on here, as you can see, I've just got some basic shop lights that are covering all the seedlings. There's about 13 trays here. And these are just LED standard shop lights. They're not full spectrum. They're not the fancy grow lights. Although those do enhance growing and speed of growing in plants, I find that you don't need them. And they're so expensive that to cover the square footage that I've got here, to cover all 14 trays, it would cost me hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get that many full spectrum bulbs going. So I try to only advocate things for my students that I can really support as far as a financial outlay. And if you don't want to build a greenhouse, but you want to get a bunch of seedlings going in the spring, this is a really good way to go. And I've just got a makeshift sawhorse with some boards, hanging lights. And I did want to mention briefly, one of the key mistakes, and I just made it last week, that you can make with seedlings is when they germinate under plastic for the first 3 days after you plant them, they're going to germinate and start popping up through the soil. At which point you want to pull that plastic off and get them under lights as soon as possible. And I missed a day when I was distracted with other things. I left them under the plastic, and by the time I pulled the plastic back, they were already an inch or two tall. And what happens then if you miss that stage right when they're coming up out of the soil, they tend to get leggy. And leggy just means they're growing looking for sunlight, and if there is no light right above them that they can attain easily, they'll just keep reaching. And consequently, you get these long stalks. They're leggy, and they get to be top heavy and weak, and they tend to fall over. So what you want to do to avoid that is as soon as they germinate and get above the soil on any seedlings, you want to get those lights right over them, an inch or two above the plants. And these are LEDs, so they don't put a lot of heat out, so that's not going to burn the plants at all with heat. And so I've got these about 2 inches above the plants themselves. And so it's a really key component of early seedling growth. So make sure you have some system where you can bring the lamps down as close as possible to the seedlings themselves, and then be able to ratchet them up as they grow. So these will get 4 or 5 inches tall, and I'll bring the lights up in coming weeks. Here, I'll pull some of these out so you can see them. I've got my peppers, cabbage, tomatoes. I've got, I think, 85 tomatoes in here. So they're all going to be gaining the advantage of an extra 5 or 6 weeks of the season that I'm creating with this artificial season that I'm giving them with these lights. So when May 15th or so rolls around, I'll be able to plant these out, and they will continue their growth cycle without being shut back by a late freeze, hopefully. Now, that can always happen when you get random events, but for the most part, that's what your frost date is about, is to make sure that that plant doesn't go into shock because all of a sudden the temperatures go below freezing. So these will go out into the beds in about 5 weeks. They're on a simple timer that runs about 10 hours a day, keeps these lights on. There's very little electricity because these are LEDs, they're super efficient. So all these plants are doing quite well. They're all open pollinated seeds, and so whatever these plants grow into this year, I can save all these seeds from these varieties for planting next year. So the choice of seeds, you want to open pollinated, the timing, you want to match your frost dates, and you want to back time that 5 or 6 weeks to get these started if you have a longer season plant like a pepper or a tomato that requires more than your regular growing season can provide. And in our case, we only have 130 days, so I have to kind of advance the growth on a lot of these seedlings. Now, some of you won't need this under lights. You won't need even to plant ahead of time because you have a really long growing season. Lucky you. But in our case, this is what we have to do. So this is just to show you my little makeshift greenhouse in the office. You don't need much. This is just on a timer, and it runs for the next 5 or 6 weeks. Another nice thing about the soil blocks is once every 3 days or so, I simply have a bucket of water over here, and I take a yogurt container, and I put about 1 yogurt container, about a quart in each tray. It fills up and soaks into these blocks, and then they have plenty of water for the next 3 days or so. And by avoiding any top watering, I reduce the chances of any mold growth or any damping off or anything that might attack those plants. And the timeline on this is once that frost date comes around, I'll put these out and harden them off for a few days to get them used to the nighttime lows and the bright sunshine. So it's going to be a different spectrum than these grow lights. So you have to let them get used to that and bring them out incrementally into the sun and the conditions that they'll be required to grow in from that point forward. That's called hardening off, and most of you probably understand that process. That's another key place where people make a mistake. They just throw everything out in the garden and it all goes into shock. And incidentally, anytime you shock a plant by forgetting to water or throwing it out in conditions it's not ready for, anything like that where it stunts the growth cycle and stops it, that's when the plant can go into a stress response, and that can attract disease and pests and all kinds of spiraling problems. So what we're trying to do overall is avoid the shocks to that plant and continually feed it the conditions it requires to have an uninterrupted growth cycle. And that's what this is all about, to help them get a leg up so by the time I put them out and the timing when I put them out, everything just keeps moving forward. The soil blocks also enhance that ability for the roots to just regenerate right into the soil so you don't have any root shock. All these things work together to align with what that plant needs to get to its full genetic potential. So once these go out on the frost date, I'll also be planting another 25 different varieties of direct seeding plants. So I'll have several thousand plants in about 2,000 square foot of garden beds, at which point they'll all be on drip feed systems on timers. So once everything's planted and the irrigation tubing is laid out, I back away and let things happen. And then the next time I really need to have any intervention in the garden is when I come out and weed once a year. And that happens right before the plants touch and outcompete the weeds. And it's really fun to see that happen, because once they completely cover a bed and you've got that green mulch layer that covers the bed, it outcompetes all the weeds, and you're basically done with that bed until you start harvesting either the plants for green drinks or whatever that plant is providing through the season. So that kind of system has worked really well for me. I do advocate getting on a drip feed system because it helps you have your busy life but not be chained to the garden all season, and it works really well. But these seedlings aren't ready to go out quite yet, but I do have some work to do outside to kind of close off the loop from last year and the growth in those beds. So let's go see what's happening out there. So I do have a few cleanup chores to finish in the spring garden here, one of which is to complete this carrot bed. I'm going to pull out the rest of the carrots. This used to be about 800 carrots in this bed, and the remainder's right about here. I have my markers where I stopped my last dig, and so these are still left over from last fall. And I've been eating fresh carrots all winter. Many of you probably saw me plant this bed with the cornstarch method that I did to germinate the carrots. Well, this is the remainder of that. And I'm going to pull these out today, take the mulch off the top, and I'll have fresh carrots for another 3 weeks or so. So that brings our carrot consumption through the winter, fresh carrots from here all the way into late April, early May. So it is a great way to extend food throughout the season in terms of carrots anyway. This is a really great way to do that. So I'm going to speed this up so you don't have to wait for it. So I'll show you what's going to happen here in sped up motion. Okay, so there we go. We've got a bunch of carrots, cleaned out that bed. Do try that at home. It's a wonderful way to go. Those of you that are already in the class already know all this, but for newcomers, it's always good to share that tip. Here's a quick close-up. I'll just approach the camera and show you what that was looking like in that bed. And these are all going to be sweeter than the day that I buried them in the mulch, because they've been sweetening all winter long. So these are super sweet carrots. One quick note is the carrots that had some wind-blown mulch where they were exposed to the sun and they started putting out the green shoots. They do that because they're biennial and they'll try to go to seed early in the spring. So if you try to do this and you find one that's got a green top and lots of new fresh micro roots coming out of it, that carrot probably has stopped producing sugar, has turned the corner, and is now feeding its carbohydrates up into the vegetative growth, which makes the carrot itself sour. So it's done. And that's why the ones that are covered don't do that, because they never got to photosynthesis. They started trying to put in leaves, but they're all yellow and they didn't quite make it. So this is the beginning of the end of that carrot in its sweetness. So you try to pull them out before that happens, or if you have really deep mulch and cold temperatures, this won't happen until May anyway. But we're starting to get quite a warm front here, and so these carrots are wanting to grow. That's why I had to pull them out now. And now let's go check out the root cellar and see what's left out there. So in the root cellar, we've got seed potatoes. Mostly all the squash is gone, leeks are gone, onions are gone, cabbage is gone. So all that stuff we ate already, but we still have a fair amount of beets that are stored in sand in buckets. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull these out, because the root cellar is at it's averaging about 47. It's starting to heat up, and these are still quite cool in the sand, so they're fine. They've been in there for about 5 months, and they're just going to be delicious. Look at that. So pretty nice looking beets. And that's about it for the root cellar, but it's nice to kind of clean that out at the end of the season. So now it's early May or early April right now. So we're just getting the last of last year's fresh food. I've got tons of stuff that's dried and canned and stuff, but this is still fresh vegetables 5 months later. And during this whole COVID thing, that has more added value when you know how to grow the right foods, store root crops for a long period of time with no electricity. This is just using ground cooling effect. It's a standard physics of a root cellar. It's been around for, I don't know, several hundred years. I'll give you a close-up of that so you can see the beets, and I'll wash them up and show you a cutaway photo of that. But these are really good beets. They're still super hard, pretty much as good as the day I put them in there, and stored for 5 months underground. So really nice, easy way with no electricity using a root cellar to save food throughout the year. And that leads me to the question that a lot of people are asking right now, especially with all this seed buying going on, which is based on the space that you have allocated for growing a little bit of your own food, what should you plant? And that's an open question depending on your priority. If you have a small garden, you might plant based on nutritional density or economy. So what's the most expensive food that you don't want to buy in the store that you'd rather grow for cheaper in your own garden? Those are different answers. Sometimes they overlap and it's the same answer. If you have larger spaces, what should you grow? For instance, if you only have a 4x8 bed, you wouldn't grow corn because it takes over the bed and you can't grow anything else. You might grow greens, like 7 different types of greens like I do in my Super 7 bed. So let me talk about plant choices and seed choices for just a second. Now in my case, I'm going to be running about 26 beds this year with about 2,000 square feet of growing space. So I've got a lot of room for diversity and I'll be planting about 35 different types of crops. But most of you are dealing with less space than that and you're trying to figure out which varieties to grow. Now during normal times, you probably would not bother growing crops that are cheap just to buy, like beans and potatoes. But if you've noticed recently, those two items can be hard to find because people are panic buying those because they're really good long storage foods. I've been growing both potatoes and beans for about 20 years, and I do it not necessarily for the economy, but the types of beans and potatoes I grow aren't necessarily readily available in terms of, say, Peruvian purple potatoes that I grow for high nutrition and low glycemic index. And also beans, when you're growing them out in your garden, pole beans or bush beans, they can replace nitrogen and magically grab it out of the air and fix it into the soil, which helps your beds and your soil every year. So I grow beans every year just for the rotational benefit of putting beans in different beds each year, and it improves your nitrogen level and fixes nitrogen in each bed that they're planted in. So even though they're cheap, it's a really good plant to have out there. Plus, if you have potatoes and beans growing every year, you have a perennial supply of seed potatoes and beans for planting the following year. So again, you don't have to buy those seeds each year. And I grow Hopi flour corn, for instance, because I love cornmeal pancakes, and I have fresh pancakes throughout the year because corn dries and stores so well that I always have a supply of blue corn around. Now, if you're growing specifically to save money and grow the most economically valuable crops, you might grow deep greens like collards, kale, spinach, Asian greens, arugula, which are really nutrient-dense foods, and you can help strengthen your immune system that way. You can quickly grow a bunch of greens in small spaces in 30 or 40 days, depending on where you are, and save money at the same time. So having a diversity of brassicas is a good use of space. That being said, just throwing seeds in the ground without knowing the timing, culture, and condition of the soil won't necessarily work so well. Success, again, is in the details when it comes to growing food at home. I'd recommend starting with vegetable varieties you already know you'll eat. Quantify how much space you have and work from there, starting with a good mix of dense greens as a first priority, and then working out from there to other crops like summer and winter squash and pole beans, since they take up such a small space in the bed. With the winter squash and pole beans, of course, you put them on vertical trellises so they don't take up extra bed space. If you have enough room, let's say more than 1,000 square feet or so, you can keep increasing the diversity of plants to include all kinds of things, which greatly increases the amount of food you can have throughout the year. If you add a few laying hens, worm bins, and compost piles to the equation, there are going to be other things that work for you if you want a more closed-loop system that provides calories, nutrition, and increased organic fertility each year. Just remember not to jump in on this gardening trend out of a sense of fear. You'll end up making too many mistakes and it won't be as fun. And that's what the program does, is we allow people to skip all those mistakes that they'd normally make without understanding the methods, and then help them get the momentum from natural systems that help you launch into the following season. And there's still openings in the class. If you want to join in, come on in. The water's fine. We kept it at half price because we know money's tight this spring. It's extraordinary circumstances, so we're here to help you out. And that's where the real fun begins, when you get a handle on these systems and a comfort level, and you get to watch your gardens improve each year and watch your plants thrive and your soil food web gets better and better, and it launches you into the next season. It really is an amazing feeling to be the key player in supporting your own health and nutrition through growing nutrient-dense food and aligning with the annual cycles of the biosphere around you. And it all starts with planting a seed.